Hello, everybody. Happy Monday. Welcome to another Browsers 3000 learning session. Today, we will have not the final learning session, but the second to the last learning session, because we have another learning session later this week where Mosh will share with you all of the information about our grants programs so that you can continue to build your hacks after the hackathon is over, turn those into projects that are ready for real people and get investment and funding, and turn those into businesses that you can run happily on your own, empowering people with distributed technologies for the rest of your life, or as long as you choose. Either one, your choice. That session, I believe, is Thursday, but I'll drop that message in the channel, share it all with you. But for this learning session, we're going to talk a little bit about our strategy for IPFS and the web. And the speaker for that session, somebody I've known for quite some time and got to know even more on this particular project. It's very interesting to me. I've been following closely, and that speaker is Dietrich. I would like to introduce him now for his talk. Thank you. So that's me. I'm going to share my screen and talk to you about our strategy. There was going to be more participation from my good friend Lidel, who is one of the reasons why I'm here working on these things. Protocol Labs, working on IPFS, but we need to make a talk specifically about programming IPFS and browsers. This one's going to be more about strategy, so you might pop in and share some words of wisdom, but we definitely want to do another one of these at some point. Probably not part of Browsers 3000 because we're running out of time. We're in the final weeks of that event, but another one we talk about the ins and outs, the upside downs of what it's like to program against an IPFS, either from within a web page or from within a web extension, or within when you have a web page and you want to program against an IPFS node that's running adjacent to the browser on the same local system, which is a pattern that we've had for a long time. So there's a bunch of different things that you can do there, both desktop and mobile, that we want to talk about. We'll dive into those deeper, probably bringing in our friend Discordian as well, who did a great talk last week for the ETH Global Hackathon about doing browser-based web app development with IPFS, how to get your web pages using IPFS so that they can do PubSub and things like that with each other. But today, we're going to talk about strategy. We're going to talk about a little bit about some of the browser implementation work that we're doing as well. But first, walk through some perspective about the web as it is today, the challenges in changing it, and the work that we're doing in adding new technologies and capabilities to the web platform itself. If you want to build a web app, you currently are limited to the set of APIs that are available in the browsers that people run generally. And you see sites like Can I Use, where you can get an idea of what those capabilities are and just how usable they are. There's kind of a threshold that developers and designers have. They look to things like Can I Use to determine whether a given technology that's shipped by a browser is actually something they can use in their products. So we want to be able to have things like IPFS, maybe even libp2p, other different distributed networks, and maybe crypto wallets and things like that in that Can I Use list, so that the massive swath of developers and designers who are building on and for the web know that they can depend on those technologies and being available, and they can use them. So that's kind of what we do. So to get started, the browser world is wide. There's really a lot of browsers in the world. There's a lot of different nooks and crannies across, as you will not be surprised, given that there's billions of people using these technologies. Sometimes browsers like UC browser, so like up there in the top 4. A lot of people have never heard of it, never even seen it. And so then some numbers are interesting. The scale is interesting too. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But really, for me, why kind of how I validate whether or not this work that we're doing is actually working and where we're getting where we want to get to with the work that we're doing in changing the nature of the web is about the capabilities. So before we go deep into the rabbit hole of massive ecosystem scale numbers and the challenges of changing the web itself, the different techniques, strategies, and tools that you can use to do that. This is kind of like the things that I want to do on the web. These are the things that I want to do with the people I know, with the projects I work on, how I want to publish and share. I want to be able to be in the same room with you, share a photo without having to go through a specific company to be able to do it, and actually use the web to leverage the hardware that we both have in our hands when we're doing this, and be able to transfer a photo without using interoperable standards and without that data ever needing to leave the physical location. The technology, physical hardware technology we have in our hand is fully capable of doing that. But a lot of the high-level application patterns that we need to be able to do that are not available. You have to install either a specific native app, which again is ultimately often a specific company, and almost every time those bits leave the room, even if the app underlying it is using some kind of protocol like MDNS or Bluetooth to be able to share it. I want to know where my stuff is. I've got stuff in old stuff in Instagram back when I used to use that. I've got stuff in, actually, I've got all these IFTTT jobs that pull from all of the services that they support that are things that I use, everything from music to bookmarking to every time I favorite something on YouTube, and it pulls all of that and shoves all of that into a Google Sheet. So I have these mega Google Sheets that have been going for years that track like where I have done stuff in other places. But it's not my stuff sitting on somebody else's server. I expressed myself or I uploaded something, but somebody else has a copy of it. I want to live in a world where the companies I don't have to worry about companies making decisions that affect my stuff. So if I'm using a service I really like, then they get bought by Twitter or bought by Facebook and shut down. I don't want to have to worry about my stuff not being available to me anymore. I want to be able to interact with groups in that way as well. Like I want to be able to hang out and talk with my family, but not have to wonder about whether a specific for-profit company is listening, or whether they're going to, algorithmically ban my account so that I can't do that anymore. I can't ever get back at those messages, and the communication is lost forever. I don't want to have to worry generally about my stuff being lost forever. So that's why I work on technologies like IPFS and Filecoin, and why I want that ability and these capabilities and these things that seem kind of like, this is not crazy stuff we're asking for here. We definitely have the technology. We don't have some of the incentives models, and sometimes we have counter incentive models to this. But these are things that I want to be able to do, and that's kind of my selfish interest in some of these technologies, and wanting to have the web that works the way that I think it should work, in a way that lets us interact directly with each other. So some of those capabilities, things that I just described, some basic things I want to do. And Juan Benet, who founded Protocol Labs and created things like IPFS, Filecoin, some friends, articulated in this list of Web3 values, which I think is a really useful framing for what we're going for, why we're doing these things, why the technologies we're developing have a set of characteristics and ways they operate, and that it's in order to be able to achieve some of these things. Technologies that have these values imbued into them often allow me to do those things that I had in this previous slide. And that's where I think we want to go to. And that's how we're going to validate whether or not we are actually shaping the web in a way that has the outcomes that we want to see and these values imbued into them. The W3C actually has a list of values basically that they use for technology development. And the IATF has one as well. And it's very interesting to contrast those with this list and think about the constraints and the differences between them, and what it would look like for an IPFS to be a W3C standard, because a lot of the W3C's work is, and even in this list, is pretty HTTP specific. So one of the challenges that we have are around like how do we crack that open? And that's something that I'm not going to talk a lot about today. The battle against like HTTP as the competitor. I think we're going to live in a hybrid world for a long time, but in certain corners around tooling, around standards, around developer attitudes and kind of like default and muscle memory the developers have. It's often the competitor is not a given company or anything like that, or even a browser vendor. The competitor ends up being like the ingrained and embeddedness of HTTP, which is very interesting. We'll probably do a whole separate talk about that at some point. Ultimately, this dynamic that we have with HTTP is that all the decision-making power rests on the server side of things in the HTTP protocol. As the user agent, the browser, the end user, when you're in the web, the choice that you have is between two different websites, maybe, but not about changing this dynamic where the server ultimately gets the deciding power in any interaction. And that's, I think, at the core of what we're interested in, what we're trying to change in this dynamic is to distribute the power, the decision-making power, just a little bit more. So for some perspective on these markets, these ecosystems that we're trying to change, there's probably heard of the browser Chrome, Google Chrome, and Apple Safari. These are the two biggest chunks of browser market share. And so when we are looking at opportunities to change things, these definitely are where we focus a lot of activity. Because if you resize those circles to match the actual market share that they have, this is kind of what it looks like. There's Chrome, 90% about, between a bunch of different browsers, and Safari. And actually, this is actually just straight browser market share. So it's just Chrome, not Chromium-based browsers. And Safari, which is an interestingly significant chunk, and most of that actually I think is mobile, not desktop, macOS, Safari, and everything else is pretty much like statistically insignificant. Microsoft Edge is around 3+%, Firefox is around 3+%. Everything else is below that. I think there's one more above 1%, and maybe that was UC Browser. Everything else is below 1% market share, according to Stack Counter. And there's some challenges with all those numbers and all numbers, but generally the picture pretty much looks like this for the most part. So if we were going to choose where to have the biggest impact as a small technology company, like obviously Chrome adding something like IPFS would be huge. However, that's complicated. Not a lot of incentives for Google to do something like that. For rendering engines, similarly, there's really only 3 left. There might be some other smaller engines here or there. But in that set of, even including most of those, like anything above 1%, there's basically 3 rendering engines: Chromium, WebKit, Gecko, and Chromium is Google's, but Opera and Brave and Edge all build on it, and other browsers as well. Really, it's a nice base for things like Electron and some of the experimental browsers we'll talk about later are built on top of these underlying engines. But again, if you visualize this by market share, and these numbers are not totally solid, but based on the previous browser market share slides, pretty much kind of similar. Gecko is the only major product that uses Gecko is Firefox, and Firefox is around 3% market share. And then WebKit actually beyond Safari is used in some other things, some other products and projects. I have learned used often in embedding for appliances. So when you're buying that new refrigerator or oven or washer or dryer for your house and it has a screen showing something, often that's WebKit underneath there. I kind of assumed that that kind of thing was always going to be Android, but that's not the case. A lot of times it's embedded WebKit. Very popular with a couple of major manufacturers. So the web rendering engine, again, not a lot of diversity in this space. How about developer communities? So we're looking at, like basically your ability to ship a technology oftentimes is directly reflecting your ability or your ability to grow market share as a technology directly reflects your ability to bring developers onto your platform. Some of the programming language, the studies and data sources, Evidence Data, /Data, these companies, they look at GitHub, they look at NPM, they talk about who's using what technologies and where. They estimate around triangulating from these different data sources around 26 million developers worldwide right now. Web development is a massive, by far the biggest chunk. Interestingly, mobile also is a really big chunk of those, like maybe about a third almost they do mobile development. Ultimately not that surprising considering how many more people use mobile every day than compared to desktop technologies. Most of the world uses mobile and not a desktop every day. But again, thinking about that relative to how many developers we have in the Web3 space, microscopic developer community. Like if we generously say that people in the Web3 space right now, let's say it's a couple 100,000 developers. I think that's probably overestimating from what I've seen. It's growing, obviously, but not there yet, not anywhere near default for most people. Most people have still never used adapt, let alone programmed one. There's a lot of work to do. And the question that we have when we're doing developer relations or growth strategy or ecosystem strategy for a new technology like IPFS, Filecoin, and really the whole Web3 space, is how to get there, how to be that default for a lot of people, for how to have developers choose your technology first. How do you become the best choice for maybe 1 million developers to start? What does a plan look like to get there? And really, this is why these developer communities numbers are interesting and important, and why they, all of these numbers that I'm sharing set the stage and set the perspective for why we're doing what we're doing, how we're doing what we're doing, how we're going to get to, say, a target of 1 million developers or 5 million developers using IPFS, Filecoin, and Web3 technologies generally. The question about technology acceptance a lot of times, comes down to browser vendors. The people that are making the browsers get to make the decision about what technologies are in them. But they participate in larger decision-making organizations, and their decisions are influenced by these larger decision-making organizations, standards bodies like the W3C and IETF. Over 300 companies, members of the W3C, go through that list. A lot of Web3 there. There's not strong engagement from crypto and Web3. Consensus, Brave, we joined this year at Protocol Labs, and a few others, but really not many. A lot of if you look at the kind of the leads in some of these organizations, boards, Google, Facebook, Apple, and often some interesting other companies like IBM is there a lot of times, and then publishing companies in W3C for sure. Like Bloomberg is a company that funded some development of popular web technologies, things like CSS Grid and a few other things. So there's some interesting names that you wouldn't, I guess, think of there, but in that list of dominating technologies and services and mega cloud companies and consumer technologies, you see representation very strongly in these groups. So while some people may say, hey, we're with Web3, we're routing around, we're leapfrogging, we're not using these organizations. Ultimately, these organizations are very useful in influencing technology decisions across very large swaths of industry. And that is an interesting opportunity because it's not super expensive to participate in these groups. And it's a way to participate in those conversations about that decision making. So they're made of real people, and those people get together and talk on mailing lists. And a lot of those mailing lists are available to everyone. And the W3C has become more and more open over years. And yet, even as maybe we don't think about these groups as we develop our technology every day, they really do affect the set of choices that we can make as developers. So as an incumbent technology like IPFS, we have to participate in these organizations in order to be a part of that conversation and to influence the decision making. W3C is a good example of where HTTP is the air they breathe. It's the hegemony. It's the default for everything. It's the assumed. Some of the conversations in W3C and W3C groups where IPFS has been, or even just parts of the IPFS stack have been in conversation. There's this, kind of like metal on metal point where, a group will be like, oh yeah, we can, make room for IPFS and other alternate protocols and technologies. And then at some point, the paradigmatic difference between these technologies from a network model, network architecture model, a security model, really, these things really, clash completely. And it's basically impossible sometimes to get something that is not HTTP into the stack, not without being part of that conversation all the time, being present. So that's what we want to do. So how do we affect change in a situation where the levers are few and far between, the players are really big, the incumbent technology is everybody's default. See a lot of technology companies and people being like, well, we just need, we need this Cambrian explosion. It's just going to happen at some point. It's just to explode and everybody's going to start using this stuff. We're going to see all these new applications that appear out of nowhere. And for me, this belies a lack of understanding of how those technology decisions are made. Sure, there are major shifts that happen in unforeseen ways. We'll talk about that a little bit later too. But a lot of times that decision making, you can see how it works and you can see how it happens. And there really are companies that are invested for decades in being part of the decision making landscape around mass technology deployment at the mass scale. And at places, and they gather and talk at places like the W3C. So the Cambrian explosion would be nice. I think we get there past a certain point of saturation of technology. The technology first has to be choosable to be able to have this type of explosion, and your technology is not a choice for developers if it's not available in things like the web and web browsers. Or natively inside operating systems. It is this extra thing that they have to do a bunch of work to get to, and nothing works well with and doesn't integrate. So there are real barriers there. And so I think that the Cambrian explosion approach towards market growth, maybe that might be something that does happen past a certain point of saturation and adoption of a technology. But other than that, it's kind of a hopium approach towards growth that really belies and really reflects a build it and they will come type of strategy or thinking anyway. Nobody hopefully says that is explicitly their strategy, but unofficially, that's how a lot of people think about technology adoption. Like, my idea is the best one. I've looked at all the other ideas. Mine works better. So if I build it, people are just going to use it because it's so much better, which is not really how technology adoption works at all, especially when you think about 26 million developers. How even getting 1 million of one of those is some huge event. Like, when you think about something like React or jQuery, these examples of things that really became a default choice for a very large chunk of the developer audience in a very short period of time. Because it was like they were like, my idea is better. Well, they built on existing technologies and augmented them, made it better. Both times JavaScript. Interesting. But the idea that if you just build the best thing, eventually people are just going to realize just how awesome you are, and every 26 million people are going to switch their behavior. It ignores the massive amount of complexity and also often barriers to choice that people have. Agalia, Brian Cardell from Agalia did a talk at the Browsers 3000 Kickoff Summit, discussing some of the different, how coming to a very large space with very large players with decisions that affect billions of people over decades, you can't find those levers. That with a nuanced understanding of these spaces, you can understand the motivations behind decision makers. You can understand the ecosystem complexities and pressures that they're under that make them choose one way or another way. And that knowledge of those specific spaces can be ways where smaller players can have very large effects. And that's really something that we're doing. So how are we going to affect change? The strategy is around knowing your environment, knowing who the decision makers are, where they meet, what they talk about, why they decide things a certain way, identifying the levers that are available to you to be able to actually change, to shift a behavior, to change a decision that someone would otherwise always make that is HTTP centric or something like that. Always be pulling on those levers. So every opportunity, like you have to be present in these places to be able to be part of that, to exert that influence, and also setting the conditions for unexpected shifts. We have seen major leapfrogs in technology many times. Sometimes these shifts are often not planned. It's not like the product manager got together and they just followed exactly the right software product development lifecycle, and suddenly like everything changed. They took over. Most radical adoption that's happening at rates that are far outstrip the size of the people that affected that change, that shipped that software. Often was not super predictable. Sometimes things like they'd already done 5 years of pre-work or 7 years of pre-work. Slowly growing market share or something like that, and then it actually like hit, and they got the stratospheric growth. So being prepared for that opportunity, setting the conditions for that opportunity is also important. So given all these factors, we need 1,000x change to be able to make a dent in a 26 million person developer decision making market. Can't just roll up with Hopium. JavaScript and web technologies and the web platform are the best opportunity to make a massive change in how billions of people make decisions, and how billions of people use technology every day. And that you need to understand that those rules, the rules of the road today, who's making those decisions about what technologies are available for developers to choose. And I've distilled that into 3 different strategies. Be on the web, be part of the web platform first. Makes you available to developers to choose. The second, be awesomely available for JavaScript. Work very well for JavaScript developers, for the largest set of developers on the web. And it could be those, Python I probably should throw in there too, because they're kind of just behind JavaScript and overall programming language market share. But being amazingly good in JavaScript will really, really lower the barriers in decision making for the largest number of developers to use your technology. And then the third is be ready for that leapfrog moment, is for when that watershed change happens. Identify what the conditions are, make sure you're available, really support and incubate the people who are doing the work out on the edges. Very different type of activity than browser integration or web platform change or participating in standards bodies, but always being aware and keeping that possibility in your mind and nurturing spaces for people to experiment and innovate with your technologies. So some of the stuff that we do to be on the web today is we work with browsers with IPFS. IPFS Companion that lidel made is a extension for browsers that improves the UX of IPFS related assets when people are loading them in browsers. Integrates naming services and ENS and IPNS and things like that. Makes it appear nicer in the URL bar. eases development with local IPFS nodes. If you have web apps that you want to access local nodes, and some other things. It also provides us a place where we can experiment. If we want to do something across all the major browsers, that's something we can try out in IPFS Companion. So the challenges, though, are that extensions today have very limited capabilities. You can't really do too much. Like, we worked for years on getting a JavaScript-based full IPFS node in the browser, but that innovation space is closing rapidly as browsers lock down the capability set of extensions. And this new change of Manifest v3 that Chrome and Firefox, I don't know about WebKit yet, are implementing is really going to restrict that capability set even further. So it's going to get harder and harder for us to be able to do meaningful experimentation, both of the UI of browsers and also at the network level from extensions. But it remains a place to be able to ease some things, and we'll continue to support and build on that. We've worked with Opera for the last couple of years, and they've now shipped IPFS protocol support in the address bar for their iOS, Android, and desktop browsers. The first company to ship IPFS features in the entire suite of their product line across those major platforms. And but it uses HTTP to talk to an IPFS gateway on the backend. So it's not a true local native IPFS node that's running in these browsers. But because of the nature of IPFS addressing, there's the high level of trust, and they're using a gateway that Protocol Labs runs. That for sure, do the addressing of IPFS by design that the data has not been tampered with, which is makes a very valuable feature and eases the development for dApp developers. I mentioned Agalia before. We worked with Agalia to make changes in all the different browsers. Actually, we worked with them to fix a bunch of different bugs across WebKit, Chrome, and Gecko that were affecting not just IPFS, but anybody that's trying to develop against a local host connection from within the browser. So this is work where it affects not just our project, but helps everybody who's developing alternative protocols that might be running a local daemon that they want to be able to connect to. They also did things like registering protocol handlers and schemes in Chromium, and also at IANA to make them available for browsers to be able to choose to accept as schemes. And we're really, as we work more and more with Agalia, starting to dig a little bit deeper. And you harken back to that earlier slide I showed where the Chrome and Chromium circle was just massive, and most of everything we see, and what most of everybody on the planet sees and uses when they are on the web. We want to have IPFS ultimately be built into Chromium natively. And this is a project that is a very, very big project, working, any type of browser development when you're actually changing the browser itself. It's very hard when you're changing the web itself, even harder, it takes a long time. But with the native IPFS support in Chromium, we get really an easy decision of something you can compile it in to your product. Then that makes it easy for browsers that are built on top of Chromium to be able to opt into shipping IPFS. For them, it's just a build configuration flag at that point, instead of them having to do a bunch of extra engineering work. And it also makes IPFS more widely known in the circles of people building user agents, building browsers, which has a level of influence that is really important for us to get to, where IPFS is not a weird choice, but it's just another protocol that you use inside browsers for different use cases. But this work involves a lot of changes inside Chromium itself, and the team at Agalia, when this is an issue, basically having the browsers are so HTTP centric in their implementation that adding an alternate protocol requires a bunch of code infrastructure inside the application itself in Chromium to be able to reasonably do something like a non-HTTP protocol. So this is some of the work that's happening this year. It's pre-work for something like adding IPFS is to actually just change how and where protocols are handled in the Chromium application itself. Chromium has a infrastructure where they have processes that run separate from the main browser process to be able to sandbox dangerous code that you read any code that you're pulling from the web, you have to assume is dangerous by default. So that the architecture of that overall application is this multi-process model that Chrome and Firefox implements. And so where stuff happens in each different process has to be changed before we can even get to the point of adding something like IPFS. So this is a long project that we're doing with them. Brave was the first browser to ship an IPFS node earlier this year, a native, or not, a full IPFS node inside Brave. They basically download our implementation of IPFS in Go and run that process and start it up and shut it down as the user wants, and passes over requests to it to be able to load data, and then renders those requests in the browser when the data comes back. They are going to be shipping Android and iOS support as well, but that will be more like what Opera did with talking to a remote HTTP gateway to the IPFS network. But this was a really big deal, and it's great to work with a browser who's interested in pushing on the idea of what the web itself could be, putting more power into end users' hands. Grew just even since that announcement. I think it was over 32 million monthly active users. So really seeing a lot of growth, and we're excited to continue working with them. Some of the other initiatives that we do in browser integration, we're very interested in how to communicate the implications of loading IPFS data in browsers. This is an example. I don't know what secure.com is. Don't go there. It's like a consultancy or something like that. This is Opera, Brave, Firefox, Safari, and Chrome's location bars in dark mode on Mac. And it's fascinating how much and how little is conveyed in the UX and the design of the location bar. And so I forget which one. Someone's a holdout there. I think maybe that's Firefox, and actually showing the scheme of HTTPS. But you can see here that it is difficult to communicate with this very constrained set of visual design affordances that you are, say, loading something over a P2P network, or that whole network can see what you're seeing. If you ask for, they can see if you ask what you ask for. They can see what that data that actually resolves to. There's a whole bunch of things that happen with IPFS that we need to be able to communicate to users that is different than HTTP and HTTPS. So we're very interested in doing design research and user research and experimentation with browsers to be able to play with this space, to be able to communicate more things. It doesn't even meet the needs of the security model of the web today. Just saying something is encrypted between you and a website doesn't mean you can trust that website, which is a major problem that browsers have today. So there's a lot of work to be done there. We've talked about the standards groups. Protocol Labs became members of the W3C this year. ITF meetings are remote, and we have the multi-codec, multi-base, and a few others, I think, on the track at ITF. But I think we want to see more. We want to see presence from not just Protocol Labs, but other people that are building with and on IPFS, and Filecoin, and also other distributed network projects as well. A lot of people think about these standards bodies as being like this chokehold over what gets into browsers, but that's not really how it works. It's a lot more complicated than that. But often, the official definition of a standardized technology by W3C is that there must be at least 2 implementations of the technology. So just because there's a document for a proposed standard of a technology doesn't mean that it's a thing that anybody has to or even ever will do. It really comes down to whether or not browsers or other types of software actually implement, and not just one, at least 2 implement technology for it to be standardized, to be considered a de facto standard. You can have that even if there's no spec, it turns out. So it's not that the W3C or the ITF organizations where they have an idea for something and they write it down and they all sign off on it and then people go implement it. Oftentimes it's the exact opposite of that. It's a browser implements something and gets feedback from developers, designers, see if it's useful or not. And then they go and maybe ship it. They talk to other browser vendors. Hey, You interested? You interested in this one? You want to ship this one too? And maybe they partner to work on a spec that is interoperable between the two browsers. And then they both ship those. And at that point, it actually is considered part of the web. But even then, if it's not a big enough part of the web, it doesn't show up on can I use past a certain percentage threshold of implementation or deployment across browsers. And that's what can I use shows, which is like how many of the available people using the available browsers out there actually have this technology implemented in the browser they use. Even then, it's not something that designers or developers might choose. So it's but what we found is that, working with friends, developing relationships with companies like Igalia will help us make some change in these places. And with Igalia, we've been part of conversations in a lot of different interesting areas that we otherwise didn't have expertise in, or didn't have people that were familiar with the community and the rules of the road, how to communicate, how to get things done in these different decision-making fora. So it's been great to work with them, and we're going to do a whole bunch more of that. The work that they did with IANA that I mentioned earlier is a place where we didn't know how easy or hard it would be to do that. They went and did it for not just IPFS, dweb, but also ETH and Secure Scuttlebutt and DAT Hyper community as well. We added them all while we were there, and that really shows that power of having somebody that knows that rules of the road in that given area to be able to do that work can then ease the journey for all of the people that then fall behind, and really help all of the ability for the web as a whole to change. Really benefits not just IPFS, but it benefits all of the alternative and non-HTTP technologies. The crypto kind of ecosystem as a whole, there's thousands and thousands of companies. There's hundreds and thousands of tokens that massive market caps and all this stuff, but don't really operate strongly in these decision-making circles. If we really decided to go the route around model, I would really like to see more Web3 space participation in places like the W3C and the IETF. You can complain about how organizations make decisions and say they're not doing what we need them to do, but ultimately they're never going to do that if you don't show up, you don't participate. Most often the decision-making process for W3C is like, what are the use cases? What are you trying to do that you can't do with the technology we have today? And if enough people show up and say, we can't, it's not working, we need these new things, that's what affects change in those decision-making circles. So I really would love to partner with a bunch of these companies and think about like, what would even a semi-unified block or a consortium of these companies who would be and participate in W3C or IETF to make their technology needs known. And I think that I'm interested to do some of that stuff this year and next year. Start talking to more of some of the bigger blockchains about how to participate in these fora to be more effective. And then we have some basic tools that we use too, like identifying what all of the different things are that ultimately all the boxes across all of these different environments that need to be checked off to be able to implement a web standard or web platform technology. And so there's all these different areas that, and a lot of this is not codified anywhere. It's not like a how to become a web standard for dummies book. So, or website. A lot of this is domain knowledge that's locked into the brains of experts that exist at a very small set of companies. So publishing information about how to do this also, I think, would uplift the whole space. So then the next major pillar that I talked about is, and really this is just some ideas that I threw together yesterday. Aside from the web standards and browsers part of it, is that addressing of JavaScript. And one thing is that like this guy or don't like this guy, like JavaScript or don't like JavaScript, you cannot argue with the numbers that JavaScript is the easiest and most accessible and most successful programming language right now that people use and choose. And some variations on it as well. And I think the famous quote from this guy was always bet on JS. And it being the runtime language, the lingua franca of the web, goes a long ways. We have JS IPFS, which is a partial implementation of IPFS. It's not a full node. The JavaScript HTTP client allows you to interact with nodes. How do we be awesomely available in JS? How do we be a first-class experience and an unbelievable development experience in JavaScript? I don't know yet. The folks that are working on JS IPFS are asking that same question. What would a reimagining of IPFS and JavaScript mean? Right now, the implementation can't connect to the DHT, which makes it difficult for it to be a first-class participant in IPFS networks. Do you need to always be a first-class participant in IPFS networks? If not, who's doing that on your behalf and how? Becomes a question. It's not an easily answerable question. But love to see more experimentation in that. That third pillar I mentioned was that leapfrog potential, keeping an eye on who has an imagination about the world that they want to see, the way that the web should work, the way that browsers should be, building the browser that meets your needs, which is kind of what this whole event is about. Who are some of those groups? Who are some of those people? How can you help them? How can you nurture them? How can you provide them resources and support? How can you expand the capabilities that they have to be able to innovate with? What's blocking them? What are the barriers? Is it resources? Is it funding? Is it technology? Is it capabilities? Are they missing a certain type of library or data store? These are all things that understanding like what that space is that people have to play, to experiment and figure out the boundaries and the breakthrough boundaries of what these technologies can and can't do. Agrigor, Mauve came and spoke, did a workshop and spoke at the summit, is a browser that implements a whole bunch of different distributed networks all in one browser. Very supportive of that type of experimentation. Frame is a operating system level ETH wallet that has an application model for loading dApps from the OS. I think that the idea of a dApp launcher, dApp store is going to be something like, we don't want lockdown application stores, please, no more. But I think this idea of having places where you can keep, remember, and launch your distributed applications, ultimately a browser for distributed applications, it's very interesting. So I'm following that very closely. Puma browser, Yuri came and spoke at the summit about what they're doing. They've added the support for Handshake, support for ENS, and support for the Coil web monetization API. So they're a mobile first and on Android and iOS, definitely making the browser that they want to see. So very important. Mask is another group that we've known for a while. Some of their developers came to IPFS Camp and working on other projects. They launched Mask this last year, and it's really blown up for them. They're doing some interesting things like just really hacking Twitter as a surface area from within extensions to be able to, they added crypto payments to Twitter. If you have their extension installed, encrypted messaging over Twitter, like all kinds of stuff where they take existing web properties and then augment them with new superpowers. They want to, I think they see also the Manifest v3 writing on the wall, their ability to do interesting things that's being closed down by browser vendors. So they're interested in building browsers as well. So I'm excited to work with them this year. But there's some more stuff too. Some companies don't like to share publicly early, but we're seeing more and more people coming and talking to us about the browser or browser-like things they're making. And I'm interested, I did a talk at IPFS or at dweb camp a couple of years ago about the age of the super browser and how I really do think that the age of the one-size-fits-all browser, go back to that slide where I showed you how basically all the location bars look the same, and how they look doesn't really tell me the things that I need to know in order to make decisions about whether to trust a website or not. I think the age of the one-size-fits-all browser is coming to a close, and I think we are going to see a explosion, maybe not a Cambrian one, but an explosion in different types of browser or browser-like things that we use every day in our lives, aside from just transient pop-up windows from other native apps that we don't control. I think there's going to be more ways that containers and vehicles for how we interact with the web in different and unique ways, and that's exciting to me. But there's a lot of hard stuff, aside from those very, very large windmills that I pointed out earlier that we're tilting at, the behemoths of technology decision-making and ownership. Aside from finding those nooks and crannies, the levers that we can pull on to make change and shift and shape those environments, there's also some barriers in the things that we have to do in IPFS still. Like IPFS is still a very young technology. We have not proven out some of the very table stakes aspects of a mass consumer technology. And some of these things are listed here. Right now, everybody can see what you ask for and what you're sharing on the DHT, on the IPFS public network. So it's encrypted on the transport level, but anyone who's part of the network can see everything that's happening on the network. There's some concerns about sending encrypted data over public networks that are valid and are going to be hard to figure out. Right now you have an IPFS node locally, but then you have an IPFS node running in a web page. So you get an IPFS node that's running on a server somewhere. Like, where's your stuff? It's now distributed across a bunch of different nodes. Is there a way to identify it, pull it, collect it, save it off to Filecoin or Dropbox or wherever you want? Not really. Your stuff just kind of exists out there in the network, and it shows up when you interact with it in ways. So there's a lot of challenges yet. Surveillance mitigation, one thing that centralization offers is at least the ability to do things like run an ad blocker, but the whole network paradigm is different on a P2P network. So all of that architecture is different in the way that you need to reduce your exposure. Even that's going to be really different. So maybe that's a use case difference. Maybe that's actual technology that we can build to change how the network operates. More fluid. I think we're going to see more fluid tools for more fluidly creating, joining, merging, and separating IPFS node and networks. I think that as we see alternate content resolution approaches develop, that we'll probably see more approach rather than one single mega network. Which then presents its own different challenges and trade-offs that you have to make. But no matter what, there's a lot of trade-offs that you have to make, and there's a lot of challenges yet, just even in IPFS itself, that we still need to solve in order to be able to achieve a much, much larger growth in developers choosing IPFS. But I think the TLDR for this talk is that, getting browsers there and getting IPFS available to choose in the web platform is going to be one of the biggest opportunities that we have to make the most change with the resources that we have. The group of communities building Web3 is not nearly Google sized or anything like that. So if you're interested in supporting and in doing some of this work and being supported, please join our community. The Discord link is up on the Browsers 3000 page. Very easy to join. There's lots of people doing this kind of work and talking about it. We also have grants programs. Mosh, like I said, is going to speak later this week on our grants program. So if you want to be paid to do some experimentation, work on innovating in the space, bring your ideas, apply for a grant. There are a number of different accelerators that are also funding projects and teams and individuals who are building things in the space. They would love to hear ideas and give you some money for you to build that dream that you have. And that's about it. Overview of the mega space that we're operating in, the mega challenges and problems that we're trying to attack, and a bit of a view into some of the initiatives that we have and kind of some of the directions that we're going. Thank you and have a wonderful week. Bye-bye.